Okay, welcome to part 2 of our gestures and poses tutorial. In this section, we're going to be covering some poses that are a little bit more complex, a little bit more dynamic gestures, and we're going to be using the same methods to break down these poses, and I'm going to show you guys how I would approach each and every one of these. And really, once you've familiarized yourself with this method of finding the main components of a gesture and building on top of that, you're going to find that a lot of these gestures, it doesn't matter what angle and what perspective you're looking at it from, they're all going to be following a very similar approach, and this approach can be applied to every single pose. So I'm going to start off by going with a dynamic pose of a male figure throwing what appears to be a spear, and like we've covered before, we're going to find the skull, the angle of the face, in which case he is looking up towards the sky, so we're going to make sure that's clear in our sketch, right? Get the eye line there as well, and then we want to find that overarching gesture line. In this case, it kind of like follows the spine and down into that leg. So I want to really accentuate that. Once we found this, we're going to establish the angle of the shoulders, so it's right about there, and the angle of the hips, which is going at an angle quite different to that of the shoulders. This is going to pretty much give me a sense of how the pose is going to look. And then from the hip, we're going to find this leg. It's about somewhere right there where he's putting a lot of force on it, and we can start building out the three-dimensional shapes. So remember to always categorize what you're doing. I like to use very simple shapes for the hips as well as the rib cage, and then build on top of it to form what looks like the human body. So using ovals for the thighs as well, and keeping in mind where the knees are, the angle between the knees. So this one's a little bit in front. Using very simple shapes and just capturing the feeling of a gesture. You'll notice there's absolutely no detail being put into the anatomical structure, like the toes and the musculature and all that stuff, because we want to get the shape down, and that's what matters the most. If something looks a little bit off, you could always tweak it. And one thing to really remember is capturing a gesture and a pose is not the same as studying anatomy. We're not focused on the small details and the way muscles look and attach to one another. We want to produce a drawing that actually looks like it's moving, like it's in motion, like there's some life to the character. Right, so looking at the angle of the arms, they kind of follow this swooping line, and then this arm goes back up, and the spear is kind of placed right there. And get the hand on there like that. And there's a very quick gesture, about 5 minutes. When you're practicing this as well, you want to remember to not get caught up in the details. You can see all of this anatomical stuff going on here with the lighting and stuff. We're completely overlooking that, and we want to just capture the main essence of the pose. We want to get the feeling of the movement to make it believable. And then if you were to actually render this piece out as a full painting, you have the option to start adding details on top of it. So the second one we're going to do is also a very dynamic pose. It's a baseball player in mid-swing, and what we're going to do is the same thing as before. We're going to find the head, find the cranium, and find the angle of the face right about there, and then we're going to look for the big swooping gesture line that goes down like that connects to the leg, and this also gives you a sense of where the spine is going to be. And because there's a lot of foreshortening going on in this composition, it's a little bit hard to tell, but that shoulder, rear shoulder, is behind the head right there, whereas the front shoulder is right here. So you get a bit of an angle like this. And what's interesting is because the body is so twisted in this scenario, the hip joints, where the leg connects with the hips, are facing almost a completely different direction than the top of the body, which is the shoulders, because there's a lot of twisting going on in this pose. So if you don't know what you're looking for, this might be really overwhelming. But since we know what we're looking for, we can tackle this pretty easily. So we're gonna look for the spine and find the angle of the shoulder. So we know one of those shoulders is gonna be behind the head. We can start to kind of mark that down. The other shoulder is gonna be in front, right under the chin almost, right? And the arms are gonna kind of go out at this kind of an angle with the baseball bat right there. Just like marking that down very, very loosely. The glute is very obvious in this case. We're gonna mark that down with the angle of the hips. So the outside hip is gonna be right there, and the hip that's facing us is gonna be somewhere right there. And after we've established that, okay, we're gonna find the angle of this leg right here, find where the knee is gonna be, go down, work our way down to the calves, and flesh out that other leg as well. And again, looking for the relationships between the knees. So this one's gonna be a bit higher. There it is. And he's putting some force on this foot. It's sliding, and there's a lot of force being applied to his ankle right there. And on the back foot, his toe is gonna be touching the ground. So it's a very, very fast process, and a process where we don't look at any of the details. We overlook that. In fact, we actually want to, as much as we can, overlook the clothing on our characters as well. We want to just see the pose. So we get up there, we can get an oval shape for the shoulder, an oval shape for the biceps and the triceps, and then another one to connect that to the front of the arms, and that's where the hand is going to be. So the other arm is coming out, and again, you know, keeping in mind the relationship between the two elbows, it's kind of like this kind of an angle, and we're going to mark that down so that that elbow is going to be right there. It's going to be connected to the baseball bat. This is a very, very messy drawing process, but you can go back in after this and really refine the lines and make it a little bit more readable and erase any construction lines that you might not want. But this is pretty much the essence of trying to capture gestures. You want your hand to move in a way that has a lot of energy. So take note of how we translated this big gesture line into our drawing. So when you can capture the angles and the right relationships between the body parts of what it is that you're drawing, you're going to be able to convince the viewer of the authenticity of the pose. And here is our third one. Again, a very dynamic pose. She is in midair about to strike a volleyball. The body is really opening up in a lot of different directions. So if you've been paying attention, you're gonna know exactly what we're gonna do. We're gonna look for the angle of the skull, right? The face is looking upwards. So we're gonna replicate that in our gesture. And notice how I'm not drawing any of the faces in these gestures, is I want to keep it really, really simple, and I want to not get caught up in the details. I keep it moving, keep the hand and the gesture very, very loose. So now we're going to look for that swooping line that goes into the spine and down and out, and that gives you a sense of the gesture right there. And then the shoulders are on this very dramatic angle because she's reaching up and the other arm is about to strike. And then as we look at the hips, there's a bit of a downward angle on the hips. And even at this stage where we've marked down some of the very basic elements, you can see the very dynamic nature of this pose starts to already come through. So then we're gonna add in the rib cage and the pelvis as well. And there's a lot of this like arching of the spine. Just want to take note of that. And then the angle of the arms is going to kind of follow the shoulder line right there. And as we move down a little bit, and then we can go into the hips, and we want to find these big oval shapes that are going to represent the thighs. And as always, if you are unsure, look for relationships between the body parts. So the knee joint right there, there's a bit of an angle, so we know that this knee should be probably somewhere right about there. And there's also a relationship between the ankles. So this is going to show us how the leg is positioned. There's a little bit of foreshortening in this joint right here, and then it's going to swoop down and connect with this angle right here, and just like that. So usually I save the arms for last because I like to work from the most important things down to the least important things in the pose. And in this case, the hand is going to kind of come up like this. So take note of the angles, right? We're always looking at the angles and the relationships between things. And there are a lot of ways to measure the length of the limbs on your character. So for example, if you're not sure where the elbow joint is supposed to be, you can just draw a line down in relation to maybe the thighs. So you can see the elbow is right there in relation to the outer point of the thighs. So if you're not sure about that, you can draw that same angle right there and you know the elbow is going to start right at that area. So really capturing accurate gestures, a lot of it is about finding the right relationships and the ones that really matter. And you can see again, this drawing is really messy, so we can go back in with the eraser and start to kind of take out some of these construction lines to make it a little bit more readable. And now moving on to our fourth pose, this is another very dynamic pose. All of these drawings have been taking about 5 minutes to do. They're really quick, and really learning about gestures and poses is being able to draw them fast, draw them loose, and capture the energy. It's a completely different method of learning than rendering, for example, because rendering takes a lot of time and you have to really sit down and think about where to apply certain colors and this and that. But in this case, we're building the foundation, we're finding the relationships, and really approaching this as a sketch. And this is the most efficient way and effective way to practice poses and gestures. So we're gonna follow the exact same process here, right? Find the head. She's kind of looking upwards, so we want to reflect that in the way we draw the head. And then we can look for that main gesture line, that main line of action. And in this case, I would argue that would probably be from the spine down to that leg right there. So we're gonna try to mimic that in our drawing as well. And once I've found the spine, I can look for the angle of the shoulders right there, and then the angle of the hips, which is gonna be something like that. And remember what I said before about, you know, taking note of where the shoulder is in relation to the chin. So the shoulder here is coming up over the chin, and that's because she is in a very shrugged and tight kind of position, and that shoulder is going to come up. And if you put this shoulder down, the pose is going to have a completely different feeling. So finding the other shoulder as well, and then we can start to give the body some volume. Right there, that looks about right. And we can start to add in the legs. And again, because this is a very dynamic pose, we want to take note of where the knees are going to be, how they're connected to one another, right? So there's this leg coming down almost straight, and the knees are kind of forming a bit of a slope right there. And then very simple shape for the calf as well, and down to the foot. For the other leg, very similar. So I would say that's a pretty convincing overall feeling for the body. And then we can get into the arms a little bit. In this case, the arms kind of go up like this, and they're held together. And a little bit right there. You can see a little bit of that shoulder right there next to the chin. And the hands together. I really don't even pay too much attention to how the hands look, but just, you know, as long as you get the general pose down, people will be able to tell that they are hands. And some of the hair just for a little bit of movement. And as always, erase the construction lines if you need to make the pose a little bit more readable. And there we go, another very dynamic pose, about 5 minutes, really quick. So here's gonna be our final pose for this series, a dancer. Again, super dynamic position. Same thing, gonna look for the skull. Look for the angle of the face. Then we're going to look for that swooping gesture in the back, as well as this right here that connects to the legs. So it's going to be something like that. Now the hips and the shoulders are not very visible, but we can kind of infer that the one behind might be somewhere over there behind the neck, and based on the position of the legs, I would say the hips are almost flat horizontal, so we can kind of get that going there. Right, so marking down the rib cage, giving it some volume, and then marking down the hip where that's going to be, and then we're going to find the angle of that as well, and then connect it back down to the legs. So we're following this big swoop that we've marked down for the legs, which is right here. We're going to just give it some volume, and then as we move down, and the other leg is actually behind. So it's you're going to see a little bit of that behind the front leg, and a little bit right there as well. So now I think the body's looking pretty good. We can move into the arms a little bit. So finding that big angle is kind of like connecting the arms. So kind of like that right there. And connect them back. Remember, we don't need to add too much detail. We just need to know the position of where things are going to be. So if you're unsure, look for that elbow, look for the other elbow, see how they relate to one another. And there we go, another very dynamic pose that we've been able to simplify and capture using a very simple technique. So I do want to talk about some sitting poses as well, because these might not be as obvious as the standing ones where all the body parts are clearly visible. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to find the skull where that is. She's looking straight at us, so it's going to be very simple, just like that. And we want to find that gesture of the spine, so it's going to be kind of arching right there, and then we're going to look for the angle of the shoulders right about there. Okay, so now you might be wondering what do we do about the hips, because we can't really see it, but based on the position of the legs, you can kind of infer it's going to be like right there. But sometimes if you're just not sure about how it's actually working, what you can do instead is use some different parameters to determine where things are going to go. So for example, in this scenario, we can look for different relationships, right? So we can see how this leg is positioned in relation to the head. It's kind of like connecting back like that. So we can look for this big angle to kind of get a sense of where that leg is going to be. And the second leg is almost like this oval shape on the floor. and it's going to connect back to the body right about there. So now we can, based on our guesses about the hip, say it's somewhere right there, and start to flesh out this body a little bit. And then based on what we see in the reference photo, we can see that the thigh is kind of going up at that kind of an angle. So we're gonna try our best to replicate that using simple oval shapes. Remember what we did before with the swooping line, so following that down to the ankle joint. And once again, let's look at where the knees are. So this one is right here, and this one is right here. There's this kind of an angle between the knees. So we found that knee right there. Now let's draw the same angle. This second knee is going to be placed right there. So that's where the leg is going to bend. That's pretty convincing for the lower body. Now we can go on to the upper body and flesh out the shoulders a little bit. So erase the construction lines as you go if you need for the pose to look a little bit clearer. But don't worry about your drawing looking messy, because that is the whole point of doing gestures. We want to get that looseness. We want to get that feeling of movement and life in our characters. So following that arm, something like that, and then the other arm is obviously going to be a little bit higher, and we can try to find where the elbows are, right? That angle right there, to determine the relationship between the arms and how that's going to look. And erase any construction lines as you see fit. And there is our seated character. Now I think I've pushed the shoulder over a little bit too much, so I can make some final adjustments here. And that looks a lot better to me. So again, don't be too attached to any of the lines you put down. Remember, if you see something that's a little bit off, you could always go back in to fix it. All right, so here's another seated pose where we don't really see the shoulders and the hips. So how do we do something like this? As always, we're gonna start with the skull and the angle of the face. So right there, really simple. And now what we're gonna do is we're gonna look for that gesture line, right? So there's a spine that's kind of like arching back. She's kind of hunched over on the ground there. And I think the shoulders there's one right here, there's one right there, but it's not very apparent. But we can kind of infer that the shoulders are going to be at this level. Since we can't really see anything going on with the hips, we're going to have to start to use some different parameters to look at how this pose is going to play out. And one of the things that I like to do when it comes to a pose where a character is very bunched up and scrunched up in a small space is I just look for the overall shape of the character. And this is something that I'm going to explain a little bit later on, as well as you go back in to check to see if your gestures are accurate. So what I see here is the character fits inside this almost triangular shape. And this triangle shape, if I can fit my character in the exact same triangle shape, then the gesture and the pose that we've set out to do for this character should be pretty accurate. So I'm going to just try to apply that exact same triangle here. And we can kind of see that the two knees are forming a bit of an angle, so you know that's happening right there. And what we can do is try to simplify it. So find where the thighs are going to be. There's this oval shape on the floor, there's that one behind it, so it's going to be something like this. So that's going to be her leg, the other one's going to be right there, and then we can follow the spine to give the body a little bit more volume, going down to the hips. Right there, that's the hip, and there's the rib cage. And we're gonna kind of just ignore the arms for now because I want to set this pose down first. And this picture is pretty ambiguous, but if you understand the skeletal structure, you can see where the femur is connecting into the pelvis, and that joint right there is where the body kind of moves from this angle to a horizontal angle. So right about there, that's where the leg is going to turn, and that's where the joint is going to connect. Use the simplified oval shape for the calf, and find where the heel is going to start. And here we've got a pretty convincing pose. So now we would try to look for where the shoulder is. That's right about there. The arm is in the center of the body. So there's going to be that shoulder joint. There's going to be that arm. This elbow right here in relation to the back elbow forms a bit of an angle. So right there, back elbow. And the arm is going to go down in between the thighs, and it's going to be, there's going to be a racket right there. Right, so there we go. There's our kind of like slumped on the ground, lazy, not very dynamic kind of pose, and it's very, very compact. And you know, we're following that same kind of triangular shape that we see in the reference photo. Okay, so this one should be fun. Again, a lot of foreshortening, a lot of things that we don't see. We don't really see how the hips are working, but we do see the shoulders. And I think the main focal points are going to be the arms and how the shoulders are in relation to one another. So that's what we're going to do. So let's give this a shot. We're going to find the skull once again. Always find the skull. Find the angle. So he's kind of actually looking downwards a little bit. So we want that to be reflected in the sketch we put down. Right, so there's a skull. Now since this pose doesn't give us a good sense of where the spine is, because his torso is so foreshortened, we're gonna have to rely more on the angle between the shoulders right there. So I'm gonna try to just capture that angle between the shoulders. So there's one right here. There's another one right about there. So there's kind of an angle going on there, and it kind of swoops back into the arm. And that's, I think, the most prominent shape in this entire gesture. So we're going to get that down, and taking note of where the body is in relation to the head. So the body kind of like is, since it's so foreshortened, we're going to see a lot of that behind the head. We're going to try to give it some volume. So there's that body. Now since we can't really see too much of the hip joints, what's really going to be important for the legs is the relationships between the knees here. So there's that angle right there. So we're going to try to find this knee, and in relation to the head, it's kind of coming down in this kind of an angle. So again, like, we're always looking for these relationships to find the most accurate gesture possible. So based on that, this knee should start right about there. And you know, it's going to connect to the thigh, so we can mark that down with a oval shape, and then draw a line over to the other knee based on the angle that we see in the reference photo. And this, because the torso is so foreshortened, it's going to come from behind the chest area, which is the rib cage. We're going to go like this. Okay, and the legs are like going almost horizontally because he is vaulting over this wall, and it's a really dynamic pose. And we can see that the ankle is right about there, which is in line with the knee. So looking for these relationships once again, and marking that down. Right, the foot, the ankle, and the other leg is right there behind everything else. So now let's go into the shoulders a little bit. You can see a really clear shape of the deltoid, which is the shoulder muscle, and at the end of this muscle, that's where the shoulder joint is going to be located. And you can see both of them very, very clearly. That's right about there, and the other one's just behind the ear. And then based on what we see in the reference photo, we can apply the shape of the delt and then move that down into the biceps. And the elbow joint is going to be starting right about where the thigh is actually ending. So make sure that relationship is correct. Now let's go into the other shoulder. So very similar process. Okay, let's look at where the elbow is in relation to everything else. So in relation to this knee right here, there's a bit of an angle there. Right, so we're gonna look for that exact same angle. Now we know the elbow is gonna start right there. And the hand kind of just fans out like that. And there we go. And last but not least, this is about as complex as you can get with a pose, but we're gonna use the exact same method, okay? And this pose is not going to intimidate us. Okay, so again, one thing at a time. We're gonna look for the skull, the angle of the face. I think that's about right. So, and the angle of the neck right there. Then we're gonna look for the spine and which direction it's traveling. So in this case, the spine's going that way. We're gonna do that as well for our drawing. And then the shoulders, since this is super dynamic, you're actually seeing a lot of his back. The shoulders are almost like this completely vertical angle right behind the head. Right, so mark that down, mark where the shoulder is going to be. Again, in relation to the head, so the head actually comes above the rear shoulder. So you want to make sure that's not taller than the head right there. So those are the shoulders, right? And we got the spine kind of like going down like that. So there's going to be the shoulder joint, and then we're going to try to see where the hips are going to be. So that's the shoulder area. The rib cage is probably somewhere right there, and the hips are going to be behind everything. Again, this torso is you're viewing it from a top-down angle, so it's very foreshortened. The hips are going to be kind of like hidden behind the rib cage. But you can start to get a sense of that three-dimensional nature of the body. So now on to some other elements that are going to show us how this pose is going to work. Well, I think one of the most prominent angles is this leg right here, which kind of connects back to the hand. And this leg kind of starts out right about there where the shoulder is, and it kind of goes back where the hand is going to end. And this is going to be able to inform us of where the arm is going to be as well. So that arm is going to kind of go over there, and the knee joint is actually right about underneath the chin. So you know, finding those relationships, right? And finding where the calf is going to be, finding the foot. And then this shoulder and the arm in front of us is in this really, really dynamic position where the elbow is extending past the very back of the body. So we're gonna just try to get this going. So the reason that I know where this elbow is because I'm comparing it to everything else that's happening here. So the back of the hip, it almost lines up perfectly with the elbow, and then this elbow almost lines up perfectly with the top elbow as well. So this shows us where these body parts are going to be. And then the forearm is coming down at an angle, and his hand is supporting a lot of the weight. And then the other leg, so based on what we know about the hips, the other leg is going to start somewhere over there, and it's going to come down, and taking note of where the knees are, there's a bit of an angle between them like that, and that's where that leg is going to go back. So just going to erase some lines to make the pose a little bit clearer. And there we go. There's our super dynamic pose. You know, there's a lot of things going on here. There's a lot of foreshortening. There's, you know, the things up close are appearing bigger and the things farther away are looking much smaller. And it's just like overall super dynamic and complex, and it can be really overwhelming, but it doesn't have to be overwhelming because we have a method to break things down. So, you know, like what I said before, find the skull, find the spine, find the angle between the shoulders, find the angle between the hips. In this case, we couldn't find that, so we had to look for some different relationships. So like, for example, the relationship between the knees, the relationship between the elbows, and this is the way that you can capture a gesture really accurately and really efficiently. But yeah, that's our way of breaking things down. I hope that was helpful for you guys to see all of these different levels of poses that you can apply the same method to, and essentially, you know, any pose that you see, you can capture accurately with this exact same method. And this is something that I've learned doing a lot of life drawing studies and practicing figures on my own. So I hope this is able to help you guys out too, to kind of make gestures and poses a little bit more approachable, you know, a little bit less intimidating, because when you really know what's going on, when you know like all these angles and the way things relate to one another, capturing a gesture is actually really, really simple. And all of these gestures, you know, the way that I've demonstrated how to do this, this is the best way, in my opinion, to learn and practice gestures, to, you know, really analyze the relationships between things and just practice with the really, really fast drawings. And once you actually learn this, you have the knowledge down, your gestures and your poses during your sketching stage for a lot of your paintings are going to be a lot more convincing. So at that point, you're able to build on top of a foundation that is very believable and very accurate. And that's kind of the beauty in this topic, because even though it takes a really short time frame in the overall scheme of your painting, it actually is one of the most important foundational elements that kind of supports the entire painting. So hopefully that was helpful for you guys. But now I also want to give you guys one of my tips, just something that I do to check to make sure that my gestures and figure drawings and whatever it is accurate. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through some of these that I think this method will really apply to. So for a pose like this, if you want to check to see whether or not your gesture and your figure actually matches what it is that you're trying to draw, the way I like to go about it is I like to look at the big shape that this character sits inside of. So for this pose right here, there's an angle there between the head and the foot, and then the angle right there between the head and the other foot, and then the angle between the feet. So this is kind of like the overall bounding shape of our figure. And if I were to port this shape over to our gesture drawing, if our gesture is accurate, it should sit relatively within the same bounding box. And in this case, I think it's pretty accurate, so this one would be good to go. And it's so simple, takes like a couple minutes at most, but it can really show you a lot. So now let's talk about this one. Okay, I think the character is sitting inside a shape that kind of looks like this. So, you know, we're just finding the outermost points of the pose, and we're trying to form a simple shape around that, and then we're going to see if this lines up with what we have here. And in this case, I think it actually works pretty well. So I think this one is good to go. Moving on to the next one, we're going to do the exact same thing. Let's find the big shape that captures this entire character. So if I were to now port this one over, I'd say that's pretty accurate as well. Now, if you find that you've ported the shape over, but your character's head is like way in here, then that probably means you need to adjust the gesture accordingly. Okay, so we're gonna do the same thing here. We're gonna find that shape that represents the character, the points, and we're gonna take that. We're gonna see if it matches up. It doesn't have to be a perfect fit, but as long as it captures the overall essence of the pose, you can see like the hands stretching to one another and going down to the feet, it kind of gets the sense of the pose down. And you know, there might be like minor adjustments that you know, the leg is bent in a little bit too much, but small things like that usually don't affect your gestures too much. It's usually, you know, if you see something major like the arm is way out here, then that might be a problem. Or if you see like the leg is way down here, that might be a problem. Let's do the same thing for this one. Very simple. Okay, we're gonna look for this big shape, these big angles, bring it over and try to match it. And I think that's pretty good as well for the most part. I think I've made the head a little bit lower than it should have been, but that's a very simple adjustment that I could make. Now for this one, big triangular shape, pretty much just like that. All right, I'm gonna take it over. And that's pretty good to me. Gonna do the exact same thing for these ones as well. And I kind of also mentioned using this shape thing for the sitting poses. So I'm gonna take this over. I would say that's pretty good. It fits almost perfectly. Now for this pose, sitting inside a triangle, and we're gonna just bring that over. I don't really see any issues with that, so I think this one's also good to go. It's a pretty complex pose here, but we're gonna try to simplify this into big shape. Just, you know, just finding the outermost points of the limbs and areas of importance, and then trying to match that up with our drawing. And I think it matches up pretty well. Again, I think we're good to go. But this one as well, we're gonna find that the outermost points that build up this shape. It's kind of like a square almost. And I'm gonna try to apply that. I think that's also pretty accurate and pretty good to go. Now, so there you go. That's a very simple and very fast method to see if your gesture is actually working and see if it's accurate. Now, I don't actually physically draw on the reference photo when I'm painting and then port it over to see if it actually works. I usually conduct that entire process in my head. When I'm looking at a reference, I would try to see the big shape that it's sitting inside and then see if my drawing actually fits into that shape as well. So yeah, there you go. That's a really simple method that I use all the time to check the accuracy of the poses that I'm drawing and the characters that I'm drawing. But yeah, that was a pretty comprehensive explanation of the way that I like to approach my poses and gestures, and some of the things that I like to keep in mind as I'm drawing these characters in these different positions. So hopefully this tutorial was able to break down some of these elements for you guys and make it a little bit less intimidating for you to start approaching poses and gestures on your own. And remember, if you're going to practice, keep them short, keep them fast, and do a lot of them. Remember, if you're practicing gestures and poses, the drawings are not meant to be refined drawings. So don't get hung up on the details. Instead, focus on the big movements and the big shapes and get that sense of a character in motion down before you start going into small details. There you go. There's our tutorial on gestures and poses. Hopefully I was able to shed some light on the way that I work and the way that I think about this. And yeah, go out there and have some fun, draw some poses. This is very loose, I think it's a very therapeutic form of drawing. So poses are great. You know, it's always nice to not care too much about the end result, but just kind of like get lost in the gestures and the flow of the drawing. So that's always nice. I'll also be putting together some material for you guys for you to be able to download as reference, but that's pretty much it. Thank you guys so much for your support and for allowing me to keep doing this in everything that I do. So I really appreciate that. I'll see you guys in the next one.